On December 1st, 1955, which is before either of my parents were born, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat at the bus for another white person. She was the secretary of the local NAACP, and in her own words, she was tired of giving in. Within a week, 40,000 black residents of Montgomery were walking, carpooling, and avoiding the bus at all costs. The Montgomery bus boycott took 381 days and a considerable toll on the entire community. Some folks spent the year walking up to 20 miles a day. The Supreme Court decided within a year that the segregated busing practices that Montgomery practiced were illegal. Out of that boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association was created and elected Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as their president. In Dr. King's 1958 book, Stride Towards Freedom, he recognized that Rosa Parks was the catalyst for the boycott that lifted the fight for civil rights into the national arena. This is a miracle, and in no uncertain terms, a very good thing. But it seemed impossible. Rosa Parks was not new to the civil rights movement, nor was her tactics spur of the moment. She was not even the first person that year to refuse to relinquish her seat on a bus. Not only was she the secretary of her local NAACP chapter, she had been so since 1943. She'd served for 12 years. She'd attended multiple training sessions on methods of nonviolent resistance, and she had been chosen by the entire chapter to risk arrest because of her remarkable character and integrity. Having been a woman of faith her entire life, when it came time to stay seated, she stood firm. Years later, she told an interviewer that, "When the white bus driver stepped back towards us, when he waved his hand and ordered us up and out of our seats, I felt a determination cover my body like a quilt on a winter night." The Montgomery bus boycott contributed to the successes of the civil rights movement and was a training ground for many of its later leaders, including Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy. These men went on to lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They led the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, and instead of 40,000 people responding, between 200 and 300,000 people were there. And within a decade of that first bus boycott, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had become law. Dr. King had won a Nobel Peace Prize, the civil rights movement had amassed millions of followers and supporters, and all of this, in large part, because a seamstress refused to give up her seat on the bus. With that, we can turn to the text. This story shows up in multiple places in the Gospel. The feeding of the 5,000 is one of the most famous miracles. People want to hear from Jesus, but they're hungry. And with a little bit of capital, Jesus somehow manages to perform this miracle, and no one notices that instead of the food quickly depleting, it increases. After 5,000 are fed, there's more left over than what they started with. It's a promise that God can provide in abundance. And like the Montgomery bus boycott, this event had a person as a catalyst too. In verses 8 and 9, we read that one of the disciples, Andrew, brings to Jesus the attention of a boy willing to share his lunch. And he expresses the same doubts that I often have. What are they among so many people? This is an impossible situation. It cost more to feed them than they could hope to earn. And yet, in verse 6, we hear, Jesus already knew. He himself knew what he was going to do. He knew before he asked. He knew that God would work through people. I have a lot of questions about this passage. Surely, this little kid isn't the only one who had enough sense to bring a packed lunch while wandering through the ancient countryside. Surely, some of the people in the crowd had enough to eat themselves. But this is the boy that came forward. This is the boy that offered his food. Not that it was a lot of food. When I hear 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes, I like to imagine like baguettes, big artisan breads, and tuna steak. And this is more like a pita saltine and some sardines. Things that wouldn't smell worse, but still didn't smell good by the middle of the day. These were things that the boy could carry. And this passage is long, and it has a lot of miracles in it. I mean, there's the healings of the sick that caused people to come out and see Jesus in the first place. there are the feeding of the 5,000, that's in verses 11 through 14. And then in verse 19, we have Jesus walking on the sea. But hidden in verse 8 is the miracle that's so often overlooked. God works through willing people. My favorite miracles are the ones that are evident through people. There are so many stories of how people have responded both to God and to the love of their neighbor and changed the world. These are the dual commandments, and when I hate to say this word, I really do, we are obedient, God can produce amazing results. There's another text in the lectionary today from Ephesians, and it also resonates on this message. In chapter 3, verse 20, we read, "Now to him whom by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine." God worked our salvation through the fully human and fully divine natures of Jesus. God inspired the writers of Scripture to tell their stories, inspired the bishops of the early church to decide which stories ended up in the Bible. And there are so many examples of these miracles, big and small, that it was difficult to decide which not to share in order not to keep y'all here all day. I picked one from the saints, and that's Mother Teresa. She arrived in Calcutta with 3 pennies and a dream to build an orphanage. All of her superiors decided that she was a little bit off. But we know and we've seen what happens from the Daughters of Charity today. They're in almost every nation, and they do amazing things. They're also the men who wrote the volume called the Big Book in Alcoholics Anonymous that has provided serenity for so many families and lives, the evident proof of a miracle each day for sobriety. These are miracles that do not lessen in impact for those that are healed and restored. And so many people respond well to the impulse to love our neighbors. It's easy to think we're alone in our goodwill. But humankind does have an amazing desire to do good things. In September 2010, a Backpage columnist posted a YouTube video called "It Gets Better." There are now more than 50,000 of these videos and more than 5 million views, offering hope, understanding, and comfort to questioning lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender youth around the world. So many of these stories involve small tokens: a YouTube video, a packed lunch, a refusal to stand up on a bus, and just a dream about an orphanage. And they range the times and places of the world. We live today in a world of abundance, unlike the ancient biblical world, unlike the streets of Calcutta. Here in Waco, we can provide food. There's a food pantry here. And yet, a YouTube video still inspires a movement that reaches more than 5 million people, inspires anti-discrimination laws, and people working within their own organizations to create change they didn't think possible. So God can do big things with little things when they're well planned out or totally unexpected. During the brainstorming process, I was writing down all of these questions I had about this passage, and one of the more telling is the thought that I wonder if the boy ate some of the fish before he gave up the rest. Because I would probably pick the biggest one off. But I don't think this kid did, and I think that's one of the really special things. He didn't sneak the biggest fish away because he wasn't afraid that God couldn't meet his needs. When I think back to this story, I wonder what kind of faith any of them had to think that the world could change, that God could strengthen their hearts through suffering, change the hearts of their oppressors, and create a more just world through something as small as sitting on a bus, sharing some crackers and sardines with some probably selfish people who did have a lunch. What did they think that God could accomplish? I don't know. This is a mission that I underestimate God sometimes, and I definitely underestimate other people sometimes. And yet, there are so many examples that these people clearly knew more about His miracles and God's whimsy than I do. The results are there. The Civil Rights Act passed, 5,000 were fed, and God works miracles through people. So, what's the little thing that God can work through you? Thank you.